Hey everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcavage. We're back for another edition of the Thyroid Answers Podcast. And today we're talking to Brandon Faust. He is a mold remediation expert. He's been in the industry. And we're going to talk about what really goes into identifying mold. How do we go about remediating mold if it's an issue and a problem? And maybe get a little deeper into how mold can impact somebody and some people and create chronic health issues. So Brandon, welcome to the Thyroid Answers Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Looking forward to our discussion. It's an important discussion for many people. I think it's a underestimated subject in regards to the impact that it can have. So it's always great to shed a little light on it.
Awesome. So I guess where I typically start is for the guest to give us some insight into who they are. So who's Brandon Faust? How did you get into mold remediation and why should we be listening to you?
Absolutely. So I think that most importantly, I have a niche in regards to a health-centric mold remediation company in Tampa Bay. We've helped over 3,500 people in the area with their homes. And the thing that separates us from a lot of the restoration companies that are out there is the understanding of mycotoxins and the impact that the byproducts of mold can really have on an individual, and that we're not following the insurance dollar. We're really looking towards what is going to make that home as safe and healthy as possible. So as part of that, I ended up doing the certification that was an advanced certification for mold remediation, where there's about 50 of us nationwide that have done the training for remediation for sensitized individuals. So of course, there's the certification that you get and that you need to become licensed in the state of Florida, which everybody goes through. There's your continuing education credits, but there's not that many of us to take it that step further to understand the sensitized individual and what needs to occur to make them safe and healthy in a home where maybe somebody else may not have an impact.
Okay. So one of the things that I think is we have to discuss, and we're not going to get probably too deep into the sciences, but we've been exposed and lived with mold for
A long
a
time.
couple thousand years, maybe or more, right? So what do you see from an industry perspective as to the reason why mold related issues have become such a thing? Is it because we have more mold in our home environments than in our cars, our work, our home environments than we've ever had before? Is the molds that are growing there more toxic and more potent than they ever were before? Are we more sensitive because we just have more chronic health issues, and mold that maybe wouldn't have infected us before has a greater potential to have an impact because our physiologies are so worn down by the load of stress we put on our system? What does the industry seem to think, and you personally, as to why mold is such a problem today?
I think that's a great question, and it's multifaceted in terms of the actual answer. Um, the the first answer would be that the building envelope has become tighter as we've progressed and we've become more energy efficient. You're having less draft that is actually going through the home. So there's less the air is being recirculated. So you're not getting as much fresh air makeup. That's number one. So if you look at it from the perspective of comparing mold to, let's say, a vehicle, and you have a vehicle outside, and it's obviously going to be releasing carbon monoxide anytime it's driving. But the solution to pollution is dilution. So there's enough fresh air that you're not actually having an impact or not a huge impact. But if you were to take that same vehicle and run it in a garage with the garage door closed and the door closed, it's going to have a far worse impact on the individual in terms of their health, and it can actually be fatal. So that's one aspect of it. The homes are tighter. The second aspect of it is the building material itself is cheaper. And if you were to take, old lumber versus new lumber, old lumber has tighter rings and the newer lumber has more cellulose, and the mold loves that young lumber as well. So not to mention drywall. We used to build with plaster, Mold does not particularly like plaster. It doesn't like the pH balance of plaster, and drywall itself is more acidic, so it's going to have more of a feast with the current new home build than older homes. So there's that aspect of it. There was a research study that was done by a scientist in Europe where he had two sets of books that he had the same amount of mold colonization on the books. He put one of them under a Faraday cage and one without the Faraday cage to block the EMF. And the one that didn't have the protection grew 600 times faster than the one that did. So I think there's an aspect of mold as a living, breathing organism that will, when agitated, goes into hyperreplication mode and also goes into defense mode. So it can become more toxic when it's being agitated. So the wavelength itself was something that's it's a microorganism, and that colonization is so sensitive that it actually feels that it's under attack when you have the amount of wavelength that is occurring in your average home. So go beyond that, and I think that the point you touch upon is also very applicable. It's the overall stress level and the overall toxic load that each of us are dealing with. And you can get into the food supply and the amount of toxins that we're probably getting in on a daily basis from the intake of the food. So ultimately, we all have a cup, and that cup gets, more and more, it fills up. And if you're not detoxing, and there's certain people that do not detox at the same speed as the rest of us, that cup's going to fill up faster and they're going to have a much more difficult time. But even your average person who does detox, like myself included, I had an issue in 2019 where obviously I'm going into moldy homes on a daily basis. I was getting a headache, fatigued, fevers. I had a pain in my chest that would not go away. And, I went to one doctor, he said, you need an EKG. Another doctor said I had Lyme disease. Another doctor said I had an autoimmune disease. And I thought that potentially my symptoms might be correlated with mold. I checked my home. I did air samples in my home. I popped, a baseboard in my master bedroom, didn't find anything. So I thought I was in the free and clear in my own home. Well, 6 months later, my AC overflows. And, I had actually done a mycotoxin test with Great Plains Laboratory even a couple months before this. I thought it might be mold related. And it was based on that report. High was like 5 to 50, and I was at 1,215. So I knew that it probably was mold related, but I thought it was because my home looked clean. It was from going into other people's moldy homes. So the AC overflows, I'm popping the baseboard, boom, sure enough, there's a toxic mold behind the baseboard. I remove the drywall, and in 3/4 of the master bedroom, there's 2 feet of Aspergillus penicillium, and it does release a number of different mycotoxins. And myco is the Greek word for fungus. So basically poison from fungus was being released into the building envelope, and it was combating with another mold called chaetomium. So those two molds were basically fighting it out. They get territorial. And I thought I was in a safe zone, and truly it was like a chemical warfare zone. So, now top that off with the fact that I'm also going into moldy homes, and that cup was filling up, and it was impacting me.
Yeah. So I guess when we look at a urine mycotoxin test, I think a lot of people look at that urine mycotoxin test and assume that that is necessarily their health problem. But I guess I could kind of argue that point. That means you're exposed, right? And
Correct.
part of what your body should do as part of a healthy detox process, if you're exposed, is you should see the mycotoxins coming out in your urine, right? Because I'm getting exposed, I'm getting chronic exposure. I would have been more concerned, I guess, in your case, if I didn't see. I would expect that if you're in a moldy environment on a consistent basis and you did urine mycotoxin testing, you could see urine mycotoxins because you're constantly being exposed to it. And the challenge is, and I'm going to talk about fear, potentially some fear mongering that's going on right now with some of the things. But if I had somebody who had lived in a moldy environment and I know they're exposed and the urine mycotoxin testing showed nothing, that would be the person more concerned about, right?
That's a red
Because
flag, right? It makes total sense,
because
right?
it's
Because
not
he's
coming
not
out.
detoxing, right?
Right. But just because you have that urine mycotoxin testing doesn't necessarily mean that you've lost your immune system is reacting to the organism itself or the toxin, right? Because you can have positive urine metabolites, but your immune system may not be reacting to either one of those. For that, we would really need more of a blood antibody test to say, hey, is my body having an immunologic response to the mold, the aspergillus, the stachybotrys, the penicillium? Is it having an immune loss of tolerance to that mycotoxin? And that's where we could say, hey, that may be creating an even bigger problem for person A. Because husband and wife, and I'm sure you see this, where this wife's like, I'm having chronic health issues, I think it's mold. The husband's like, oh, yeah, we're going to have this guy come in. You say, yes, there's mold here. And he's like, listen, I'm in the same environment. I'm fine. It's not bugging me. He's got the problem. I think it's in her head. Like, and you're telling me it's mold. You're going to charge me all this money to remediate it. Like, because if it was just the exposure to mold, right? And we said, look, you've got urine mycotoxins in your urine. He's got urine mycotoxins. You're both in the environment. Why is one person reactive and not the other, right? So I think we do have to be somewhat
I've never
concerned.
run into that scenario before in all my years of doing mold remediation. So
You,
absolutely, I've run into that exact scenario, multiple
yeah,
times, right?
yeah.
Because, and look, sometimes it's a reverse role, right?
Oh
But
yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah. It doesn't
usually,
matter somebody. So
right?
usually it's not, sometimes it could be everybody in the house is impacted by it. Sometimes it's
Correct.
one or two or a couple people, but there's a couple people that are saying, well, if it was really the issue, wouldn't I be
Yes.
experienced? And this is where I try and tell my clients, listen, you we've all been exposed to lots of mold. And just because you're in the environment, it doesn't mean it's the root issue for your health issues. It very well could be. But we have to be cautious sometimes when we do certain types of testing. I'm not saying you weren't exposed. I believe you were. And I would have been shocked if you said, listen, I'm in mold environments every day and I never have any urine mycotoxins in I'd be shocked, because it would be like, okay, maybe you've got the best respirator in the world and your clothes, you wash your clothes and you white suit it and everything else. That's perfect. That's great. But I think if you're in that environment pretty consistently, you're going to probably show some level of mycotoxin.
Zero question. And that's really where the PPE is important, but it's not foolproof. It's not like
Right.
completely airtight. I have a beard,
Hmm.
and there's certain respiratory units that you would use, especially if I was doing the actual remediation myself,
Hmm.
that would be not just an actual respirator, but it would have airflow to make sure that the mycotoxins are not coming in. But, you know, when I coupled it, and look, for me, the real proof was in the pudding, is that once I removed the contaminated material within 3 weeks, the pain in my chest went away. The fatigue went away, the headaches went away, the joint aches went away,
Hmm.
and then I did another mycotoxin test, a year later, and the levels were completely different. And was
Yeah.
there still some mycotoxins present? Of course, and do I take action to protect myself long term? Like I do, an ozone sauna, and I do other, superhuman protocols to detox as well, and take binders and things along those lines to protect myself and make sure that that's available for my guys as well. But there's no doubt that when you have that overexposure, it can complicate things. And you're right. Some people are going to be more sensitive. Not every person is we all have different immune systems. The person that might have their life saved by the antibiotic penicillin, well, that's their wife or their husband could have a serious health impact because of that same antibiotic if they're
Hmm.
allergic to it. So we all have different sensitivities, and there's 100,000 different types of molds. And to
Hmm.
say that you're allergic to penicillin, but maybe cladosporium doesn't have the same impact on you as penicillin may, right? And that's
Right.
also something to keep in mind.
Yeah. So you said something about a Faraday case. I'm thinking there's a lot of people that don't know what that is. So can you just clarify what that is for listeners?
Of course. I mean, it's a protection mechanism against EMF waves. So really it's fending that off and preventing that actual EMF from coming through. And, that's my layman understanding of that particular technology.
And so there's been some discussion that we live in homes today that have so much EMF activity. Some people say, oh, it doesn't have an impact, or it doesn't matter if you've got Wi-Fi and all this Bluetooth stuff going around. It doesn't create any challenges or problems from a health perspective. But I think there is literature that's showing that one of the reasons potentially that we have more uh, more problems is the fact that as you were saying, we were putting all this frequency into our homes, and that can create, some mold that was maybe not less threatening. Now we're constantly stimulating it, and it's trying to defend itself. And we don't see this just with mold. I mean, when we think about even things like ragweed, in areas where they spray ragweed to kill the ragweed, they find that the pollen count is higher in those plants. Why? Because those plants are getting sprayed. They have to defend themselves. They have to protect themselves. So they're creating more allergens as a response to it. So for the people that say none of this stuff really creates a change, I think that's potentially a little bit naive to say, hey, we can put all this frequency in there, because we are frequency beings, right?
100%.
So it may be one of those major factors that can create some challenges and some problems. So, I think when it comes to signs and symptoms, mold, and I should say loss of tolerance to mold or mold toxins can create a host of signs and symptoms. What should be, from an industry standard, like what should alert somebody that it's potential for them, a mold intolerance may be a potential issue that they might need to have their home, their vehicle, their workspace evaluated?
Well, I think that the easy and sort of low hanging fruit on that question is, if you're seeing mold, or you're smelling mold, that's never a good thing, right? I would never say that they're having mold in your home is good. That's just not true. There's no mold that's a good mold in your home. Now, with that said, I mean, unless you like blue cheese or something like that, or mushrooms, because you can say, well, that's a fungus, really. But at the same time, if you're seeing colonized growth in your house, I wouldn't turn a blind eye to that. That's something to look at, and how do we get this resolved as quickly as possible? Is it going to require a professional, or is it something that we can handle on our own? And really, that's something that we can touch upon later in the conversation. But in terms of other signs and symptoms, the most important thing is the people test. How do they feel in their home? And really, it comes down to that question that is Googled often: is my home making me sick? And mold is one of those things that could be contributing to that home making them sick. So if they go out of town for 2 weeks, if they just went away for the Christmas holidays and New Year's and they felt great, and then they come home and all of a sudden that chronic cough is coming back, or all of a sudden they're fatigued again, or they had more energy, while they were away, well, maybe it's something inside the house that's actually contributing to that. So now that leads us to the question, do you always smell mold? And the answer is no, you don't always smell mold. And do you always see mold? And of course not, because it can be hidden. It can be hidden behind walls. And the spores are microscopic. And really, and truthfully, you should not be able to see a mold spore. A mold spore on average is about 7 microns. The human eye will stop visually being able to see things at about 40 microns. A human hair is 70 microns. So you can fit 10 mold spores on the tip of a hair. And if you're seeing mold, it's usually the colonized mold. And if you do have colonized mold that has roots and it's growing, the chances are extremely high that it's also off-gassing. It's releasing the mycotoxins to protect its territory, to defend itself. And on top of that, it's also releasing spores. And the spores themselves can act as a foreign invader to the body, which can create a histamine release, and there's certain doctors that have talked about mast cell activation syndrome, or chronic inflammation response syndrome that are triggered by mold and its byproducts or potentially other allergens, you know, beyond that. So, but it is something that mold can contribute to without a doubt. And you breathing in or you're inhaling a foreign invader to the body, and you can wind up with inflammation. You can wind up with, you know, other things that may not be as acute, but might also be long term. And that's really where the doctors like yourself that have a knowledge come in to help their patients detox, you know, and we as remediators that are health centric help to contribute to that by making sure that the home is as free as possible from mold and its bytoxin or byproducts.
So if it is a concern for someone that, hey, I've got some chronic health issues, haven't seemed to be able to have eliminated it via um, medication, diet, lifestyle changes, supplementation. What's considered the best way to really assess it? There's whole mold kits you can get at Home Depot. There's Lowe's. There are obviously people like you that'll come out and inspect it, and there's different levels of testing, I'm sure. So let's talk about testing. What are the different strategies for testing, and then the validity for some of these tests?
Great. Yeah, I think that's an important subject to dive into without a doubt. Similar to what you were just talking about with the mycotoxin panel, it's not a end all be all, that's the answer, right? There's other tests that you want to do with it to really determine if that's actually what's causing the issue. That could be a good sign, you know, that you're detoxing. So there's other tests that you would want to be taking, and you look at the whole picture. So in a very similar way, that's what you want to do with mold inspections and making sure that, because look, you could rely on an air sample. The problem with an air sample is that they're 70% inaccurate, right? Especially in terms of missing it, because the air samples are really they're spore traps. They're only picking up the spore. They don't pick up the actual mycotoxin, and the mycotoxin is the thing that's going to have the longest or the biggest health impact. Direct samples. I would say every mold inspection should also come with, you know, direct samples, especially if you're seeing colonized growth. Just because you see something that looks like mold doesn't necessarily mean that it is mold. So having that confirmation is a good thing to do. Now, in some cases, it's really clear and it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck. You can pretty much assume that it is a duck. But then there's other testing. There's more sensitive testing that you could do, like the ERMI test, the EMA test, the HERTSME-2 test. There's these various tests that are testing for the actual DNA of mold. And then there's a time and a place for each one of those tests. Like the ERMI test, you may want to do it on the front end, but then it's doing an algorithm that the home may be far cleaner, but based on the algorithm, it throws it out of whack and it looks like it's worse when it's actually not. So there's a test that you want to do. Usually the HERTSME-2 is the right test to do at the end of it. And it's kind of going, but even that is like you're only getting your top 5, you know, mycotoxins or molds that are actually making people sick. So that's another thing that you look at. The other one is, you know, I've seen a lot of accuracy with, believe it or not, a mold sniffing dog.
Oh no,
You know,
I've had clients use old dogs for sure. Yeah.
right? And they, you know, not 100%, but there's very few things that are truly 100%. So, but it's something that allows you to get closer to that X-ray vision that we do not have, because even thermal imaging is not going to do it. Thermal imaging is going to show you temperature differential and give you a concept of where the water source may be coming from. But then you have to do moisture mapping as part of that, and you have to check the moisture content. Then there's a history of the home. Has there been any sort of floods? Has there been any sort of leakage? Has there been any sort of like overflow that wasn't handled correctly? So all of these things are being taken into consideration. There's a new company called Air Answers that is now using some of the technology that was developed during, you know, COVID for detecting of mycotoxins. So that could be the future of testing, to actually find out what mycotoxins are floating around in the air. And then that's the physical aspect of it as well that I think goes hand in hand with, you know, maybe it's the first step before even going to testing the home, you know, is how is the person feeling? What are their blood sample showing? What's their mycotoxin panel showing? And now if we see that there's elevations and that there's a problem, let's get somebody in there to do a deep dive on the home using, all of these different methodologies, whether it's direct sample, it's petri dish sampling. There's immunolytics that does at a pretty good cost, a whole round of petri dish testing that you can send that in. That's a great way to do it. That's more economical. There's the air sampling. There's My Mold Detective that you can do your own testing. You set up a testing kit and you do it for 5 minutes, and they're calibrated to go for 5 minutes, and you have multiple samples, which I think is also important. There's also understanding that, yes, every home is going to have some mold spores. A lot of people say, well, every home has mold. It's not an actuality. It's every home is going to have some mold spores. And if it has colonization, that's a different story, because the colonized mold is what's also going to produce the toxic gas. And then it's a matter of, well, how much is there? And is that considered, mildly elevated, highly elevated? And some people will say, well, it's not a toxic mold, so that's okay. No, I don't think so. You have allergenic, pathogenic, and toxic molds. And truthfully, a lot of the ones that have been classified as allergenic have led to health issues. So,
And I think
right?
that if you have a allergenic mold and you have moisture, the potential that a more pathogenic or toxic mold may develop in time, possible and probable, correct?
Oh, look, there's certain molds that are considered, there's dry molds and there's wet molds. The wet molds are like Stachybotrys, Chaetomium, Eulicladium, Fusarium. They're molds that need a certain moisture content in order for it to grow. Now, why is it important to differentiate between dry molds and wet molds? To me, the biggest reason is not how toxic the mold may be, because that's not easy for us to say. It's actually, where is the mold coming from? What's causing it? And what do you look for? Because if you have a high count, let's say, because Stachybotrys and Chaetomium, they're considered zero tolerance molds. So why is it zero tolerance? Because if you have a couple spores, it means that you probably have a leak. And if you have a slow leak and you pull those cabinets back, the chance is you're going to have a massive situation behind your cabinets that is off-gassing a toxic substance.
And whether you have a massive overgrowth or not, if you have a moisture issue, it's likely just a matter of time until you do. Even if you don't have it today,
Yes.
you have a high probability of having an issue. So I want to make sure we give the listeners a lot of actionable data. So in general, if somebody thinks that they might have an issue with mold, one of the things to consider, like if we're thinking about first steps, right? Where do you see step one? Do you see step one like, hey, have your practitioner run a test, like a urine mycotoxin test, an antibody test? I would say initially for a lot of people, if you want just a, if you say, I want to know if I have if mold is my health issue, that's a question. If somebody says, I want to know if I have mold exposure, that's a different question to me, right?
Correct.
Is the mold creating an immune response in me and potentially an autoimmune response? There, I would look at more of the blood testing to see if they have antibodies to some of these things, the toxins or the molds, because that's going to be your immune system is now reactive. It's lost tolerance to that thing. As soon as it comes in, you're going to have this antibody immune lymphocyte response. And that doesn't happen to everybody because we're in the environment and the lymphocytes aren't producing antibodies to these things. And a significant, like, call out the military and the special forces to go get this thing, right? So if somebody feels like, hey, I've got chronic immune issues, chronic health issues, how do I know if this mold is an issue that's driving my immune or autoimmune response? I would say blood. If you just really want to know, do I have excessive exposure to this? Then I would look at a urine mycotoxin test. If you have it in there at higher concentrations, to me, I would say then the next step is to evaluate where that's coming from, regardless of you have an antibody response or an overt immune response to it or not, because it's potentially just a time factor. And it
Correct.
also might indicate, depending like what you said, depending on what's showing up on there on a urine mycotoxin test, is this likely wet or dry issue? And hey, maybe I do have a bigger issue. I've got a leak, a moisture issue somewhere that I'm not aware of. So would you think those things are valid? That process so far?
100%. The concept of the person finding out if it's causing health issues, I think, is a really important issue. In some cases, there may be a mysterious health issue that they are not getting an answer for. They're not seeing actual improvement. And that's where I would start to question, is mold potentially contributing to this? And depending on their climate, depending on the environment they're in, there's going to be red flags and things that you kind of know already are not going to be good. So let's say they're in the home, they're not feeling any physical, you know, impact, but they have a musty smell that's just not going away.
Hmm.
There's no way that long term that that's going to be good for that person as well. So if there are clear signs that there's potentially mold in the home, I would say that that's a point that you also want to take action, because some of these things may be acute. You may get an immediate response, but some of them could be long term. And if you look at the, mycotoxin profile that, like when you go to Vitality or you go to Mosaic or you go to one of these companies that is doing the mycotoxin testing, and they show the different mycotoxins and what they're linked to, some of them are more long-term issues like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc. And, do you know that immediately? No, it may be, down the road. So realistically, you don't want the elevated levels of mold spores and mycotoxins in your home either way. So even if you may not be feeling it, you want to at least be aware of the fact that mold could cause an issue, and you want to keep your home just like anything else, right? Like, what are the things that we need for survival? Water, food, and air.
Hmm.
And the cleaner your water is, the cleaner your food is, and the cleaner your air is, the healthier you're going to be. So if you have that understanding that mold will impact the air quality one way or another, you want to be on the lookout for it. And, if you see it, figure out, okay, good, what's the best way for me to resolve this? And is it something that I can do on my own, or is it something that I'm actually going to need a professional's help with?
Yeah. And for the listeners, like, let's think about this like your car. If your car was leaking oil, you could say, it's not a big deal. It's not real. I don't think it's really a bug in the car. It seems to drive fine. I drove to the store, it came back. It's not a big deal. But if your car is leaking oil, that's abnormal, right? Shouldn't be doing that. So
Right.
it may not be a problem today. You may be able to drive that car back and forth to work on a regular basis until you can't, right? And then you're going
Correct.
to maybe look back and go, man, if I had done this, I had addressed this sooner, maybe I wouldn't have blown my engine, right?
Correct.
So if you see noticeable possibilities for mold, you have moisture issues, should be clues, or the musky smell, like, hey, this room always smells musky. It's probably a good sign to not just put plug in air freshener in there, right? Or spray your Febreze or whatever it is in that space, but to say, okay, what's causing the issue, right? Because unfortunately, if we could see the impact of things like EMFs and particulate matters, uh, like an immediate response, we'd probably all take more action on it. But the problem is, we often don't see the impact for an extended period of time, and then we're like, "Oh, I've got this problem," but we're not necessarily tying it to uh, this chronic exposure that we may be getting, right? So, if they see noticeable issues, moisture, damp, if they have sensory, visual, smell, any of those things that indicate that, hey, maybe I've got a mold or moisture issue, that should warrant some type of assessment. And if you have maybe some chronic health issues, especially when nothing else seems to work, it may be warranted to get some testing done physically to see, is there any possible overload of mold. Uh, I'll just reinforce this point. for the person who's getting urine mycotoxin testing done, if you know you're in a moldy environment and you know you're sick and that urine mycotoxin test comes back clean, there's nothing showing up there at all, especially if you've got weight issues, gallbladder issues, liver issues, um, skin issues, it probably that test is probably a false negative, and
Yes.
you might need you might not see that test get positive until you start the remediation process and the load comes off. And then you might see the mold showing and the mold toxin showing up in the urine. And you might think, hey, I didn't have these in my system 3 months ago when they found the mold. And now all of a sudden I have it in my system. Now I have a problem. No, that might be you releasing it. The follow-up test after that, 6 months, a year, is an even better test to say, is that over that time frame, as you're getting further and further out, the first test you might see, hey, I wasn't having anything in there. Now I got remediation done. I'm out of the environment and not exposed to it. You may get the first test, you might see some. The next test, you might actually see a little bit more. If the first one was negative, you might actually see it. And then over time, if you run that, I think it's a good strategy to say, hey, did we really get all of this stuff? Because those mold toxins at that point should be starting to come back down again. Is that what you see as well?
I totally agree with what you're saying. And yes, it is true. Sometimes it gets worse before it gets better, and you're actually detoxing, and then your body starts to feel it. And we've seen that as well. The most important thing for us as the remediators is to make sure that we did as thorough a job as possible and took all the actions to prevent cross contamination of the home, and allowing the inhabitants to have a safe environment. Even, look, I don't really recommend that people stay in their home while mold remediation is going on, period. But if it is where you have to stay there, then you definitely want to have proper engineering controls in place that prevent, the cross contamination of the home. But to your point in regards to the sequence, picking a mold inspector before you do remediation, ideally you would get an inspector who's separate from the remediator to come in and do the deep dive on the home. And they're doing a host of different sampling methodologies, not just one, because if they come in and they're sort of a low end inspector where they pop off 2 or 3 air samples and an outside air sample, and they say, oh, well, your inside air is better than your outside air, you're good to go. Well, you might have a false peace of mind at that point in time, when in actual fact, the spores were not, floating around at that particular area, because it's really testing a certain cubic parameter in time. So if the
Mhm.
mold is not sporulating, if the, door was open before the inspector, that could have gotten in there and skewed the results for the worst, because outside air
Mhm.
might be more moldy. So you really want to look at, everything going on in the environment and have a host of sampling that takes place to build an indoor air quality profile on that home. And when you have that, and then you also want to find an inspector that is health centric and understands what a mycotoxin is, understands that, just popping off a couple air samples isn't acceptable, understands that mold, on the vents is actually something to be concerned about, and not something that they brush off as, well, every home has some mold on the vents and it's no big deal, it's common, right? Because that mold is usually 99% of the time a mold called cladosporium, which has been brushed off as a no big deal, type of mold. But then you find out later on there's a lot of research that has been done by particular doctors, and it does release a mycotoxin. It does lead to skin issues. It can set a person up for having their entire body covered from head to toe with rashes. So, and you have respiratory issues that come with it, etc. So, an inspector that is not kind of, old school or, not health minded is not somebody I would allow in my home to do an inspection. So you want to vet your inspector as well. So that would
So,
be another major step.
yeah, so something you said, there's a couple things I want to go there because I want to walk kind of through the steps of, okay, how should we go about get this thing evaluated? So, um, But something you said is the inspector should be separate from the remediation company. Is the standard that they're separate, or is the standard that they're together? And if they're together, is there obviously there's a potential conflict of interest there?
There is a potential conflict of interest. At the end of the day, is the person going to, because look, there's only 5 or 6 states in the nation that requires that it be separate. Okay. And, Florida is one of them. But I think that it's a good idea no matter what, because number one, you're getting two sets of eyes on it. Number
Hmm.
two, you don't have somebody who's got a vested interest or who has a dog in the fight, but is there and has your best interest at heart to really do a thorough job. Now, with that said, are there some remediators that are actually far better than most inspectors at finding it? Yes. And if those guys are honest and they're on your team and they're able to tell you, look, I do not see a situation if there isn't one, and they're open and clear with you about that, then hey, that might be better than even having some inspectors. But I think a rule of thumb, it's better to have a separation and have them working together, because then they can also cross check whether or not the remediator got the product that they were supposed to get. And I think that's where you wind up with potentially an even bigger conflict, is where the post remediation verification or the clearance testing is another way that we call it. And it really is post remediation verification. Did they get everything that they were supposed to? Is very important, because otherwise there's no checking. The person could maybe let something slide where somebody else wouldn't let it slide.
Okay, so let's talk about. I think I've got mold, or I've got some mold mycotoxins, or I've seen some mold in my bathroom, right? And I where's at what point do I do my own test? Do I bring in a mold dog? Do I bring in an inspector? Where would you suggest for the general person? Because that's what a lot of people want to know is like, how do I, where do I go? Like, what steps? Can I just go get the Home Depot plates? Is that really valid? Is it not worth it? Do I bring an inspector in? And if I'm going to bring an inspector in, where do I find somebody who is health conscious that does mold inspections? Or can I just go to Home Depot and just get plates and send them off to someplace? So what's from somebody who's in the business, how do we go about doing this the right way so we're not wasting time and money?
I would not use the Home Depot test. I think it's just you don't have enough outside expertise helping you on that and really evaluating the information. I think Munalytics does do a Petri dish sampling methodology, and if you use that, it is more economical, but they also have a lot more experience. And they have a bird's eye view of seeing so many different sampling come in. So if you follow the instructions and you do it the way they say to do it, then you can have a pretty good idea of, is there an issue that warrants further inspection. I would not rely on that, as it's not going to find the source. Really, what are the plates going to tell you? That there's spores in the air. Most homes are going to have some spores, and then it's going to tell them, is there more spores than there should be for that period of time? So is it a cheap route to go? Yes. Is there value in it? Yes. Now, of course, every problem, you have to look at it in terms of what's the end product that we're going for. Is this, health issues? Is it because it's an eyesore? Is it because, I don't like the smell? And how much of a health issue is it? If somebody is potentially have life-threatening issues that may be being exacerbated or made worse because of mold, and they have, then they may want to go the full Monty and pay for one of these higher end inspectors. But those are not cheap, especially the ones that are really good. Like you have Brian Carr from We Inspect, who does an extremely thorough deep dive on home. And it's not just mold, it's also bacteria. It's also, VOCs. So they're really establishing an indoor air quality profile on the home. Or certified mold assessors. They do a very thorough inspection as well. but the price of their inspection could, in some cases, match the price of what most people pay for remediation. So it's not cheap to go that in. So it's like, do you always want to go to that level? Well, if it's, health, if it's life threatening, then yeah, I would do it, because at the end of the day, there's no point in wealth if you don't have your health. So now, can you go with some guys that are more mid-tier that are going to do a pretty thorough job? Yes, and you might want to combine efforts, like get your, a good inspector, and then follow it up with the mold sniffing dog. That maybe he's going to find stuff that the mold inspector didn't find, because none of them are absolute. You could do cavity samples in walls, but are you going to cavity sample every single wall in your home? Probably not. And, so are there things that you can do to increase your chances of finding it? Like only focus on the areas where there's moisture, like your faucets, your laundry room, your bathrooms, these types of areas? Yes, but what about if you have seepage issue and the slab is degraded, or it's actually the vapor barrier has degraded, and now there's capillary action occurring with the slab, and you have wood floors, and then you have an entire nest of chatomium under your floors. Are you going to find it? Not necessarily, because it's a heavy spore and it's being weighted down by the actual wood. But could the gas itself from that mold be impacting you? Yes. So then it leads us to another type of sampling, which is a dust sample. So there's another test that you can actually do it yourself, which is the dust test on thedusttest.com. I have no affiliation, but I know that you're able to find, the mold and its byproducts using that sampling methodology. There's real-time labs that also you can do your own sampling as long as you follow the instructions. So the question is, is there one way? No, there's multiple ways to do this. It's how much do you want to pay? How fast do you want the results? And how thorough do you want to be? And all of those things are taken into consideration.
Yeah. So the challenge is for the average person, they're sitting back going, thinking, hearing all that, and they're going, yeah, but I still don't know what to do. So let's give them an idea of middle of the road, best strategy for the average person who maybe sees some mold issues, maybe has some health issues. They are concerned about it from a health perspective. What's the low end, medium, and high end? So you got low, medium, and high, but typically with most things, you'd say probably the middle of the road strategy is going to be probably the best, right? You don't necessarily want to go with the cheapest strategy because it may not be as effective. You may not need the full Monty, but maybe that person who comes in that does the medium level testing comes in there and says, you know what, there are problems here, but we need to do more, another tier of testing based on some of the things I've seen here. Can you break it down that way?
Sure. And I agree with you. So low end, I would say go with the immunolytics Petri dishes. That's your kind of low end budget method that's probably worth doing. Some of them, it's not even worth doing. Okay. I would never tack on a mold test to a home inspection like that. To me, it's like, why bother? The home inspector doesn't even know what to look for or where to look. So don't even spend the money on it. Immunolytics, you're going to cover more areas of your home. Now,
and what's that? So people know what that is. Immunolytics. What is that?
So it's a company that supplies the Petri dishes and enough of them so you can put them in different rooms, and it gives you exact instructions in terms of keep it for this length of time, close it, send it off. We're going to tell you, is this a wet mold? Is it a dry mold? And now you can take further steps. But at least you've kind of gone past the first threshold of like, is there something to be concerned about, or are we in a pretty good spot?
Okay. And that's something the person can do on their own, and they're paying a company like Immunolytics. And ballpark, what would we say costs for something like that is?
$300 to $400, maybe 500, depending on how many samples, but something along those lines.
Something along those lines. All right. So that's low end, right? That's basics, right? The Home Depot, the Lowe's things, skip those, go right to the Immunolytics. That's better. All right. Let's go middle of the road.
And you could also tack on, you could use like My Mold Detective as well, which is air samples, right? Petri dishes, air samples,
Is My Mold Detective, is that another thing you can do on your own?
It is, yes.
Okay. And so one's plates, one's air samples, right? What did you say the difference between the two was for the listeners?
The petri dish is going to collect a little bit
Mhm.
more history. It's there for
Yep.
longer, right? The air sample, I think, has a higher rate of inaccuracy because it's only testing for about 5 minutes. Now, if you come back with in 5 minutes, 5,000 on the Aspergillus penicillium, then you probably have a problem. If it comes back with, in certain molds, and they'll be able to tell you based on those molds what's an acceptable range and what's not,
Right.
you know. So if you come back with 10 on Stachybotrys, then you definitely have a problem. That's a zero tolerance mold.
Okay. So the
So
immunolytics is like $300 to $500 if you want to add on the air piece. But if the immunolytics it has some of these things, Stachybotrys, penicillium, you don't really need to do the air test. You're moving on to the next step, which we'll talk about in a sec. If you
right.
do want to be a little bit more thorough, you could do like my mold detective. That's an air sample test. Give me ballpark. What does that look like?
Usually that's about $100 to $200 with the actual samples. Depending on how many samples you get, it might be more,
Yeah,
right?
but that's
But
good
it's a
ballpark. So
pretty
somebody has an idea, right?
Yeah, it's a pretty economical route to go for sure. And look, you could go and do the testing yourself and get those results and then hire somebody to help interpret it for you, you
Mhm.
know. And there's a number of people that do consulting that can look at that and tell you with a knowledgeable eye, hey, look, that's an issue. Or this is not something that, I would be super concerned about. But just make sure that they're health centric and they're not somebody that's going to brush off, you know, mold and it causing physical issues.
But aren't those two companies going to give you a report that's going to tell you, hey, this is Stachybotrys, this is a problem, this is a problem, that's a problem? Or are they just telling you what's there? They're not giving you an
Oh
insight
man,
as
let me
to,
let me tell you, the first time I looked at an air sample test, I thought I was reading Greek, right? Like I really had no idea what I was looking at, and
okay.
kind of interpret it. And there's so much information, it's like information overload. They may give you 17 pages, of information, and you're like, what's important in this,
Okay. So
in
it's
all of this
probably not a
information?
bad idea to have a consultant when you do those to help you to break it down and determine what the impact might be on health and well-being, right? All right.
Yes, I would
So
say
let's say
absolutely.
that's level one testing. Let's go middle of the road, which might be um, maybe you know, where the vast majority of people go. So what's middle of the road testing?
So the most common is to have an inspector come out. And really, you want to make sure that that inspector is not going to just do air samples. That's probably the most important datum of all. And also that they know where to look and what to look for, right?
So how does somebody know
Because
that?
they have experience, right? They have been doing it for a while. They understand the health impact of it. Uh, for example, somebody might look at black mold. That's easy to see. But what about white mold, Aspergillus, that's humidity driven, and it might be on white surfaces? How do you find that? Right? So that's where you're going to want somebody that has a black light and is going to be able to see the difference in texture and is going to be able to see patterns, because there's certain types of patterns that mold will have that is like growing and starting to hatch, and then it becomes like a furry fuzzy mess. So
So are they going to look for a certification for that perspective? Is there a website where you can say, okay, I want to find a certified, experienced inspector? Because anybody can say, hey, I'm a mold inspector, and the general person isn't going to know whether
whether or
they
not
got
they're telling the
if they're
truth,
good
right?
or bright. So how do we know that? Is there a certain training? Is there a certain certification that is going to be a good clue for somebody that says, hey, this is a person that knows what they're doing? Because somebody could say, I've been doing this for 20 years, and maybe they have, but they may have been bad at it for 20 years as well,
That's
right?
also
So
true.
how does somebody know?
Well, the good news is the transparency that goes along with the internet today. There's good and bad with that, but there's truthfully, you can look at reviews and, is this person able to answer certain questions regarding mycotoxins? If they don't know what a mycotoxin is, I wouldn't even bother. That's
So is there a list? Is there somewhere where somebody might get a list of questions that they could use to interview an inspector to
yes,
say, hey, I think this is a good
absolutely.
person? Where do they find that?
So there's a phenomenal free resource that you can find on Facebook. It's free to join. It's Mold and Toxins, Healing Your Home and Body. Okay, so
Okay.
I'm, involved in a bunch of these different groups, but in terms of a level-headed approach with accurate information that, the people are willing to answer up, and the actual person that runs the group, Kendra Seymour, she's extremely knowledgeable, but also even keeled. And they have a number of references that you can go to that are free resources for the person to read and educate themselves. They have all of that, but it will give you some of that. Now, to answer your question for your listeners, like on an immediate basis, you could also go to normie.org, which is the National Organization for Remediators and Microbial Inspectors, and they should have guys that have done the training um, and done the class on it. And again, it's also interviewing them, because I can't vouch for every single one of them. There's a lot of guys on Normie that maybe are not that great, but they should be better than most. They've at
Mhm.
least gone through 3 to 4 day class. You also would look for certification. Somebody who's done the certification for remediation for sensitized individuals, I would expect them to be a lot more knowledgeable than somebody who's just done like certified mold assessor. The person that's done the advanced indoor air quality specialist training, that person's going to be more knowledgeable. They sat through, a week of training with the president of Normie himself on approaches to mold inspection. There's also another certifying body, which is the IICRC, which is a good body for sure when it comes to if they've done the uh, mold class, right? So there's the water class, and then what comes afterwards is the mold class. So if they've gone through that training, they're more knowledgeable for sure. That's AMRT. And I think I get that exact definition for you, but it's some mold remediation technician, right? So it's applied microbial remediation technician is the class that you'd want to do through the IICRC. Look for that. Do they have their AMRT certs, applied microbial remediation technician? And then there's the
Okay.
ones again with Normie. So it's experience, Google reviews, certification, and the person themselves. And do they seem like there's somebody who's knowledgeable? And then your own research using a group like, mold and toxins and healing your home and body, right? I think that when Mold and Toxins Healing Your Home and Body Facebook group. It's free to join. There's over 24,000 members. I think it's a fantastic resource.
Awesome. And ballpark for somebody, what are they looking middle of the road ballpark cost for what should they expect?
They should expect about $1,000, right? If they're going to do enough tests to really get a good idea of what's going on there, you know.
Okay.
And depending on how many tests you do, if you do like an ERMI test, it's going to end up costing more, because the person not only has to do the test, but then there's also the actual costs for developing the labs, right? Just like a functional medicine doctor or integrative medicine doctor is going to have costs for, lab development. The same thing
Hmm.
with a mold doctor.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I want to do is just kind of get a ballpark, and then the full Monty. What is that, and what's somebody considering cost wise there?
It really does depend on the size of the home, right?
Hmm.
Because that determines the amount of tests that are being done.
Sure.
But let's just kind of talk about
Let's
what
say an
goes into
average,
it.
like an average 3,500 square foot home. Um, what are we looking at?
So for me, that's a large home, right? A 3,500 square foot home is usually pretty large, but let's just say, take that number. Um, they're going to go in, two people, usually a full day. They're going to be looking in your attic. They're going to go into your crawl space. They're going to be doing cavity samples. They're going to be doing bacterial samples. They're going to be doing moisture mapping. They're going to be doing thermal imaging. They're going to be doing air samples. They're going to be doing direct samples on anything that's concerning. They're going to open up your air handler. They're going to look inside your air handler. They're going to go to every potential water source. So you're paying them for the deep dive inspection, two guys that have specialty training, usually, maybe one guy. and then you're going to be paying for the development costs and a markup on all of that. So I've seen that anywhere from, $3,000 to 12,000,
Okay.
depending on the size of the home. You know, if
And
it's an 8,000,
that's a real forensic assessment, right? We're really
yes,
getting down and dirty. Okay. So now we've done some testing, either the low end, the mid grade, or the forensic assessment, right? Full Monty forensic assessment. And somebody says, yes, absolutely. There is some problematic molds here that need to be done. This is where a company like yours comes in and needs to do some level of remediation, right? Is that
correct. So let's
so?
take a
What does that look
mid-tier.
like?
And so a mid-tier inspector should also give you a report, but they should also give you a protocol. And the protocol is what you follow to make sure that that home is now safe and free of mold and its toxins based on the areas that were hot. So you're relying on the inspector's information to give you an action plan as a remediator in terms of this is what needs to be done in that area. Now, of course, a lot of that is not that different. There's a sequence that an experienced remediator should follow on pretty much every job. So the inspector is pointing in the areas that are contaminated, and they're saying, look, the lower kitchen cabinets, this area is going to need to be handled. And then the remediator should know at that point in time what goes into doing that, but the inspector should also write that out. So it's clear that this is something that actually needs to be done, not just something that the remediator is tacking on to kind of boost his profits, but is actually something that should occur. Now, with that said, a thorough remediator like myself, we're going to go for redundancy on any sort of indoor air quality problem. So what a normal inspector may recommend, we might do a little bit more than what that person is doing. And as long as the homeowner understands that and wants that, then we're good to go. We could always go with kind of like the bare minimum, but I usually don't recommend that approach. So now that you've had all the inspections and you have your report and you have your protocol, that's when you would then hire your remediator. We didn't talk about the mold sniffing dog, but
Oh,
that,
yeah.
you might want to bring the mold sniffing. For me, that's kind of like you could combine that with the mid-tier inspector, and that may not be a bad idea. Or you could just kind of jump to the mold sniffing dog. It's kind of like your, immunolytics and your, air samples, and then bring in the mold sniffing dog who's going to be at about $500, but you might have to pay for travel costs,
Mhm.
and you might not get a full report, like in terms of very science based from the mold sniffing dog, but at least he's going to give you the hot spots that you go, okay, this is most likely going to be an issue.
Yeah, and just a little anecdotal stuff. I had a client who we did test her, did have immune reactivity to I think aspergillus, penicillium, and maybe stachybotrys as well. Now, the spouse said, "Hey, I saw mold, I cleaned it, right? It's all taken care of." And I'm like, "Well, maybe, but maybe not." And so then we talked about bringing an inspector in to really check because she was really struggling with significant health issues, and they got a quote on the cost. It was just more than they thought was they could afford, and the husband was pretty convinced that, hey, I don't have an issue. I cleaned up what I saw. It should be okay. So the mold dog was brought in, and the mold dog hit on all the places he cleaned and a whole bunch of other places that they didn't realize. And for them, that was the like, okay, we've got a bigger issue here. And then that was the okay, we either need to spend more money, get out of this environment. We got to do something because this is real. So that for the listener, that can be, I agree, that could be like a verification because the dog has no financial incentive, right? It's just going in there. They're trained just like smelling drugs or anything else that they're going to say, hey, there's a corpse here, there's a drug here, there's mold here based on it. And it could be, it could miss it, but man, they can train these dogs to do some amazing things. So I think that's a good potential tool as well.
And look, I think it's like when you look at it, it's 90% effective. That's pretty, pretty good, right? When
Hmm.
you compare some of the other options that are
Hmm.
out there.
Yeah.
so, or even 95% effective. And, it goes bomb sniffing, hard drive sniffing, whatever, right?
Hmm.
So they can be
Yeah.
trained to do it. And, even though we may not be able to smell it, they're going to be far more sensitive to it. But to talk to the point, and I think it's important for your listeners to know as well, that the concept of like cleaning mold, that it's really an important thing to touch upon, because a lot of people do it. And even if you go on certain official website, they're going to tell you, use some bleach, spray it down, and you're good to go. But really, what they're advising is almost taking a baseball bat to a beehive. Because what you're actually doing is you're agitating, aggravating, and spreading the mold when you go and you wipe it down. And you may not be locating the actual cause of it as well. So let's say it's a humidity driven mold and is not particularly a water source, except for the fact that your AC unit went out and there was enough humidity in the air that mold started growing on pretty much every surface. And you hire a cleaning company to come out and they wipe everything down and there's no more mold. But air samples are going to tell you far differently, because now you're at 10,000 mold spores floating around. You may not see any of it. It may look clean, but then you start moving pieces of furniture, you start lifting cushions, and before you know it, you're seeing colonization there. And then you're wondering also, like, why are you sick 6 months later? And it turned out that the handling was not sufficient, because all you did was agitate the beehive. And now the bees that you do not see are putting their poison into your body. And that's what can occur. So now, look, if there's a little bit of mildew, which can also be classified as almost a euphemism for mold, but let's say there's a little bit of mildew in the shower. To me, not a big deal. Hit it with a mold removal product, hydrogen peroxide, concentrate vinegar, or something like that, and that may be totally sufficient. But really, I would start asking, is this coming from somewhere? And even if it's in the shower, it may not be a coming through the tiles. In America, where we have central heating and air, I would look to the air conditioner. And is there potentially colonization in your air handler or your furnace that is now blowing spores into an area that has humidity or has moisture, and it's landing on a surface that has enough nutrients, skin cells or hair or whatever, that is now starting to grow. So you have to always look at, where's it actually coming from? Where's the source? And in most cases, I would not suggest that somebody just go and wipe it away or clean it, but they dig deeper and they find out what's actually causing it and then address that.
Yeah. And so from a remediation perspective, obviously the level of involvement depends the level of problem, right? And so costs could vary significantly based on what's going on. Um, but when we think that, hey, we've got a home that's got some mold issues, like I think the question for people often is, some people are like, I'll just move. But part of the issue is, are you moving the same stuff that was in that same environment with you to the new place? And if you did, there's a good chance you just brought that same problem with you. Is that
The
accurate?
chances are extremely high. I mean,
Right.
extremely high. I'll
Right.
give you an example. We had one home where a very wealthy family, they had a sort of their vacation home on the water in Clearwater. It was pretty large. She bought a cowhide footstool, and she liked going into antique stores, and she found this, thing that she loved. She put it in the closet. The humidity levels being on the water were over 60%, and the AC was not functioning at the level that it should have. So the humidity went up to 70% for, a couple months. They came back, and and the closet was almost the size of a room for most people, was fully covered in mold. And then it had started to then spread to the rest of the house, because the AC unit was pulling air. You have air coming in and you have air being pulled out, in terms of the return, and then distributing it throughout the house. So they actually ended up with a mold problem not just in that one area, but the entire house.
So what needs to be potentially addressed? Clothing, furniture, carpet,
All of
like
it,
what?
all of it. So if
So
you
that
had a extensive mold problem, then yes, 100%, because it's not just the mold spores, it's also the mycotoxins. Now, the mycotoxins don't have the ability to replicate. They're just a poisonous, secondary metabolite, or something that a organism, puts out to either defend or attract. Really, that's kind of the easiest way to define that. So they're putting this out that can act as a poison to the individual. Now, the spore is really the thing that you would be more concerned about. If there's elevated levels of spores you're bringing into this new location that can then germinate and hatch and then start colonizing and then growing and offshooting more spores. So is there an economical route to handle that? Through my own personal experience, I can tell you absolutely. Now, would it be something that, let's say, a body like the IICRC would advocate? No, but they might have reasons for that. Okay. And I won't get into those reasons, but just like big pharma in the medical community, there might be reasons that there's a little bit of a relationship that is questionable. So for me, from a heuristic point of view of actual workability and what has worked, there is a fogging system from Pure Maintenance out of Utah. And, it's not the only fogging system, but it has a non-toxic, product that they basically atomize and fills the entire volume of the home. And basically it results in a detoxification of the air itself. And to me, that's a vital step for any remediation project, because if the mold has been there and it is colonized and it has been shooting off mycotoxins and spores, I would highly recommend it. Now, would I accept it as an end all be all for a remediation project? No. Is it a handling that is effective? And is it a budget handling? Yes. But at the end of the day, you have to find the source, you have to find the water, you have to find the contaminated material and remove that, because even dormant mold can then start to grow again. Right now, if it's no longer able to grow, then that's a different story. And there's certain tests that you can determine whether or not it's actually able to grow again or not. And that's something that you would look into.
And so what's the strategy for that? I guess that would help with carpets and furniture these things may be on.
Yes.
What about clothes and books? Would a strategy like that help address, you know, your books and I mean, because, when you pick up a book, I mean, you get some old books
Here's
from somebody and you're like,
Yeah, well,
hey,
that's like, look, if it's musty and you have a book and it's like you're kind of going through the pages. I actually got sick from that same exact scenario, and I didn't know it was mold. And this was back in like 2010, where I was helping on a project, where there was old files that had had water damage, and not knowing what we were exposing ourselves to, a lot of us were getting sick and we didn't know what was actually causing it. And it was from the mold spores and mycotoxins, because it was musty. There was zero question that there were mold in these files, but we did
mm,
not realize there was a health impact. There was no PPE, there was no mask, there was no gloves, and I was waking up every morning with my feet on fire saying, I
mm,
feel like I'm toxic. I don't know what's going on or what's causing it. So could you have a situation like that where, look, if the fog doesn't touch it, it's not going to break down the mold spore or the mycotoxin. And that's really what you're looking for, is as much access as possible for the fog to do its thing. Now, if you have a proper fogging system similar to Pure Maintenance, where it's a pressurized fog and it's atomized and it's pushing into all the nooks and crannies and crevices, then yes. But is that some people would roll over in their grave that I'm even talking about it. And there's kind of like the people that are super thorough, the people that want to use the equipment as your go-to method. But I would say it's a slice of the pie that is a very important slice of the pie on any remediation project, or it's a quick fix as long as a person knows that it's not a full handling, that it's going to drop the levels and give you relief in terms of the mold spores and mycotoxins. But if you don't handle the source, it will come back.
And do you recommend, because I mean, the average person doesn't know what it really takes to remediate a home, right? So again, how do we know that we have the right remediation company? I'm guessing there are certifications that we should be
Yes.
looking for. So what are the certifications? What is the same thing we talked about for the inspector that we should be looking at for the remediation company?
Sure. So similar bodies, the IICRC, right? For sure. And that's showing that they've at least gone through the classes that educate them on the basics of water and mold remediation. And there's certain basics that are going to be on any project that is being done correctly. So what do those look like? And then there's the normie certification, same type of thing. They train the remediators. There's other more sort of mom and pop certification companies that do a great job that are not necessarily worse than normie or IICRC. Those are the ones that are most well known, but there's some certification bodies that are smaller that do a fantastic job in terms of educating the remediators. But really, it's talking to the remediator and understanding where they're coming from. What is their experience? Have they dealt with people that are sensitive? What is their approach going to look like? What are they going to build containment? Every job should start with, really looking at the job, seeing what's going on, finding the source. And then once you have that located, you build containment around any area that you're going to do any sort of removal. You establish negative air, which is basically taking the air within containment and blowing it outside and having a fresh air makeup filter, on your containment or whatnot, that's allowing that clean air to come in, the bad air to go out. They will do precision cuts. They're going to be less barbaric. I would not rely on a general contractor for mold remediation. A lot of times they're just going to come in and tear it out, but they've just cross-contaminated the rest of the house. So unless they really understand mold and they're going to take the precautions to make sure that they don't do that, I would not use a GC on it. I would use a professional remediator that knows, have the dust walls fully up, make it as tight as possible, have negative air, do precision cuts, use a dustless saw, remove the contaminated material, put it in a bag, have it in a thick contractor bag, gooseneck it, treat the material. In most cases, you're not going to be removing structural material. But what are you going to do there? You're going to treat that material and you're going to clean it as best as possible. Potentially, you're going to sand it. But if you're doing that, you absolutely have to have negative air going when you're doing that to mitigate and minimize the dust exposure. Then you can potentially, in some cases, encapsulate it after it's been fully removed. A lot of inspectors don't like the encapsulation method because something might be being hidden. So that's something to also take into consideration, right? So once they've done all of that, then I would say duct handling is usually something I would call for, where you brush the ducts, you clean the ducts, you sanitize the ducts, you then seal it back up so that you're not recontaminating. Then you do a micro cleaning in that room, HEPA-vac, damp wipe, HEPA-vac again, it's redundancy. And then afterwards, I would sanitize the entire space. So that to me and then you have equipment running for at least 24 to 48 hours. And then you get clearance testing. And that should show that this invisible intruder is now gone. Right.
And then should there be a follow-up assessment 3 months later to say, hey, we did remediate, it wasn't anything at the time, but now it's 3 months later, and we want to just come back and make sure there isn't should there be a follow-up, or is that like an extra? Like
It's
you
an
don't have to do it?
It's an extra, like realistically, if you have a good PRV or post remediation verification and clearance tester, he goes in there. Now, with that said, if you're going for health reasons, I would say absolutely, let's get an ERMI test done and make sure that we've gotten the actual source of the contamination in the first place, or get, a HERTSMI test or one of these other ones done, just to make sure that maybe the remediator did a fantastic job on that spot. But what if something was missed? And that's where I would say that would be a crucial element to it. But once you have a good inspector that's gone into an area that's been remediated, they should be able to tell you, yes, this area is good to go. And their eyes, their nose, and their testing kit should be sufficient to be able to give that area clearance.
And is there, just from we think about maintenance, wellness, to prevent some of these things, what guidance would you give the person who doesn't think they have a mold issue, right? as, hey, these are things that you should be doing fairly consistently in your home to make sure you're reducing the risk of these issues? Is it like, hey, you should have your ductwork cleaned maybe uh, every 3 years? You should have some type of assessment, done some way. What is there any suggestion there?
Well, I'm glad you asked because I actually just recently finished writing a book called Mold Free Living: How to Prevent Mold in a Humid Climate, and you can actually download that book for free at moldebook.com. And it goes over 15 action points, to keep your home as free of mold as possible. And whether you're in a humid climate or not, there's a lot of information that is really valuable. Now, with that said, to give you an immediate answer, I would say doing duct sanitization, every 6 months with a product that is approved to actually run through the AC unit would be a good idea for sure. There's a company called NADCA that is a duct cleaning certification body that does a great job at making sure that guys know what they're doing when it comes to duct cleaning. Having purification devices, there is proactive purification devices. There's more passive purification devices, like a HEPA filter would be passive. It's waiting for stuff to come to it, whereas proactive may be ionization. Some people like low levels of ozone, they may be like totally fine with that. I don't particularly like ozone, so I would go ionization. UV lights are fantastic
Aren't
when it
there
comes to
units that you could be put on right on your heating and ventilation unit? It's
100%.
infrared and ozone related. They just go right on, and so as circulation's going, it's treating the air that's coming in and out at the same time. Aren't those?
Correct.
That's what I put
Yes.
on. I forget what the name of the unit is, but we put one of those on our
So
system.
you just got to keep on top of those because the UV lights do go out. So it's
Hmm.
usually within every year I would, change the UV bulb
Hmm.
on one of those units. But yeah, there's a Remy Halo. There's one
Yeah,
from
Remy Halo.
uh,
That's the one I think I have.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
probably the most well known. There's other ones out there as well from Best Living Systems has
Mhm.
a really good unit called a multi-cluster ionization unit that you plug right
Mhm.
into the HVAC unit. So it's a whole home purifier is the best way to call it for your listeners. But
Yep.
yeah, I think those are really valuable, and having a combination of UV plus purifier is what I recommend in the book. So that because I've seen units in the same exact home in the same exact closet that had the purifiers and a UV light, and one unit that didn't have the purifier and a UV light, and the one that didn't have the UV light got infested and overgrown with growth. So the UV light on the blower wheel made a huge difference, or being close to the coils because it's going
Mhm.
to break down microbes,
Yeah.
and it's a great thing for preventative. Now, is that going to handle a home that already has an issue? No. If you have infestation, you really need to source removal is always the key when it comes to mold.
And then there's lots of units, and you may not want to. I don't care if you name names. I don't have a stake in it anyway. But there's lots of units out there that people get air purifiers for. Hey, um, a kid's going to college, right? They're going to be in some apartment that you almost can guarantee there's potential issues there. Um,
Yes.
can they use? Are the units that you see, molecule, air doctor, some of these other systems, are they, some are relatively inexpensive, some are extremely expensive. Is there, are these things beneficial? Obviously, the easy answer is if there's mold, you got to remediate it. But can these things be beneficial in a situation where I got a kid going to college, they're not remediating the
That's
dorm
an
room. They're
easy
not
yes.
remediating. So
Yes,
easy,
that's an
yes.
easy yes. Yeah, absolutely. Zero question about it. And I would do a combination. I wouldn't rely on just look, the molecule is good, like you said, the IntelliPure is good, Air Doctor Pro is good. Those are some of the ones that I do talk about, in the book, the mold ebook. But I would what I have at my house is I have a Valara Air and Surface Pro that allows me to do an ozone blast while I'm away.
Mm-hmm.
It has ionization capability while we're in the home. And
Mm-hmm.
then I also have an IntelliPure that has a HEPA filter. There might be some other ones that are also incredibly good. And that's where, you do your own homework. But yes, you want something that is going to capture contaminants or pollutants or pathogens, and also using technology that does exist to break down, pathogens or mold spores or bacteria that can get into the environment. So I would use a combo of the two.
And the system that you have, is that a system is that a freestanding unit, or is that something that's going on the heating and air conditioning system?
The Air and Surface Pro is a standalone unit. It's basically like a foot high, foot wide. It's pretty sleek looking. It's not a huge eyesore. The molecule is probably the best looking in terms of packaging, but I'm a little bit, I'm like over the top on this stuff, so I have the Volara, I have the IntelliPure. I'm putting in a brand new system from Best Living Systems, the probe into my HVAC unit.
Mm-hmm.
But I've also found that if I'm not staying on top of it, I wind up with a situation. Like, it was concerning to me that when I opened up my HVAC plenum, the box that sits on top of the furnace that connects to
Mm-hmm.
the ducts, that I literally had a petri dish in my own plenum, and it was causing issues. And it was because the bulb went out on my purifying device. So that's
Mm-hmm.
why I talked to that. So within a short amount of time, a few months, there was all kinds of growth in that box. So you really do have
Yeah.
to stay on top of it. So,
All right.
we have a
Yeah.
combination of technology.
Yeah. I got to double check I have my heating and AC guy come in every 6 months, and I should ask him if he's double checking uh,
And
that
here's what
Remy
I'll tell
system.
you, like, in some cases, your AC guy, especially in Florida, they can't even mention the word mold, right? It's actually, if they say we're handling mold, they're breaking the law. So they won't even go there, right? It's
Yeah.
like they say organic growth or
Yeah.
potential buildup or suspect growth. And they may just say, well, yeah, just put in this unit and it's going to handle everything. And it may not. And some of them, you're looking for a company that's like NADCA trained, is going to clean your unit and then also know what to look for. And ideally, they would have a mold license so they know what mold looks like. So for us here in Florida, we have the mold remediation license and we have the air conditioner license, because a mold guy is also by law not able to go into the AC unit. So it was this kind of really weird problem that was created through legislature, where the
Hmm.
only person that's going to know how to properly remediate an AC unit is a mold guy, but he can't go into it. And an AC guy can't even say that there's mold. So the end result was people that were getting sick and they had no idea what is coming from. That's actually
Yeah.
a current situation. So having somebody that has both of those licenses, we stay away from the install on the actual air conditioning units, but we definitely address the ducts and the purification devices and the remediation of the unit for sure. And that's, I think, an important thing to find, but you may
And
not. It's hard to
I
find.
see a lot of people marketing and advertising duct cleaning. Um, is there what concerns should somebody have about that? Because it sounds like a good thing. Why did I just have somebody come out and clean my ductwork?
I mean, look, it's a huge concern for me unless they're doing it right. Because truthfully, we go back to the beehive analogy, right? You kind of like hit the beehive and you disturb it and you agitate it, and it's not good for you. It's not good for the home. It's just not good. So how do you do it? Well, you need to, number one, do a thorough job. So you're like $199 special where they come in, they get in your house, and
Hmm.
then they sell you a UV light. Skip it. Don't even bother. You know, you want somebody that really knows what they're doing, which is where the NADCA certification comes in, or your questioning comes in. And you say, okay, what are you going to be doing to actually make sure that this system is clean? And then also, how do we make sure that we're not sick afterwards? So they should be using like a HEPA air scrubber, and they should be doing whole home sanitization afterwards as well. Because if you had mold build up in your AC system, it didn't stay there; it
Right.
blew around the house, right?
Right.
So
But I think just general, somebody come, you just see people say, hey, get your air duct clean, air systems clean. I know somebody who has one of these companies come in, and as they blew all these things out, they blew dust and particulate all over the home. Uh,
pathogens,
yeah. So what was
contaminants,
ever, so now you got, just dirt and dust in the
just
home.
that
And you're like,
that's enough, right?
that's what you can see, right?
Yes.
So what happened that they didn't see, because it's just somebody who's, I'm a duct cleaner. I clean ducts, right?
Hmm.
They went to some how to make a business seminar, and hey, everybody is in fear of uh, of problems. You get market cleaning some of these ducts. You go in there, you blow them out, you're good, right? Um,
Yes.
but didn't go so good for this
Yeah,
for this
and really,
person.
again, I think if it seems too good to be true, it probably is, right?
Hmm.
If they're sitting there saying they're going to clean all your ducts for $199, there's probably something that doesn't make sense about that. And again, it comes down to consumers and listeners educating themselves and making sure that they find guys that are knowledgeable, that are going to do it the right way with morals and scruples. And sometimes the person may not even know that they're doing it the wrong way. So that's
Yeah.
where the listener or the consumer has to educate themselves if they want clean water, clean food, clean air. Like there is that, you got to go down that rabbit hole to whatever degree, or find people that are knowledgeable on the subject that you can get advice from in terms of the quick, down and dirty, like, good, give me the punchline, give me the executive overview of how to handle this. And, again, back to the mold and toxin group on Facebook, that's one of the things that I love about it, is that you can have your layman post a question, and within 24 hours you're going to get enough answers that you're going to see a common pattern. And then you could also, if there's a point that you have in question as to whether or not it's accurate, you can go and check one of the resources in that group that is usually pretty accurate. The lady who started the group, believe it or not, Kendra, she's not a professional mold remediator. She doesn't make money doing it. She got impacted by mold. And so
Mm.
she then went and did the training, the same training that I did for the remediator for the sensitized individual. So for me, I have a lot of respect for somebody that would go and do that and get themselves educated, then start a group at no cost. She's not getting any sort of financial benefit from it, but it's just giving free advice that is valuable advice, so I
Yeah.
think it's a great resource.
Yeah, I think having a great resource. I mean, and we want to do that in everything. We want to give resources, but to really get something done and get something well, it doesn't matter the industry. Everybody wants to pay the least amount, but at the end of the day, if it seems too good to be true, it seems cheap. Yeah, cautious, right? You want to take a look at and I think for almost everything, get get a couple quotes, high, medium, low. Probably somewhere in the middle is probably the reality. Even in my industry, I know I had somebody who came to me for help, and they're like, hey, uh, I think you charge too much. I say, I don't think I do, but hey, that's great. And they're like, well, this person charges $99 a month for unlimited functional medicine. I'm like, that's awesome. I would go see them for you. That's probably a great match for you because you're looking for a deal. But I can tell you, I don't this for $99 for unlimited care for a month. You know how much time I put into each individual case on each individual appointment? I mean, I'm already with the appointment person, 20, 30 minutes on an appointment, plus the prep time, plus the post-visit time to get notes together, consider what their concerns were, maybe do a little research, change protocols. And there's no way anybody justifies even though it's cheap and it brings people in, you're not getting quality return on your investment. So therefore, even though it seems cheap, it's very expensive because at the end of the day,
100%.
you're going to pay what you seems like a deal, get limited results, not probably get the outcome you want, and then you're going to be more frustrated at the end. So whether it's this type of stuff, and this is why we kind of wanted to break this down. What are the ballparks? Because most people don't know, and somebody might look at it and go, well, this guy, he's going to do a middle of the road, he's going to do an inspection. It's only 99 bucks, but he's also works for a remediation company. So they're not making money. Maybe the $99 is just to get them in the door. If maybe they're reputable, maybe they're not, but you might want to pay, and I agree. I tell clients all the time, you probably want to get somebody who's doing the inspection, who's separate from the remediation company. That way they don't have anything, they're just
There's
doing the
nothing to
inspection.
gain.
Right.
It's
There's nothing to gain. You're paying me a good fee, a reasonable fee to come in and do this versus, it costs them $50 for the hour that it's cost them money to drive there. It costs them time. Their time is worth money and their expertise is worth money. And if you're just paying somebody on it cheap for an inspection, guaranteed you're not getting quality work done. And so I agree. The value is in, we got to think about value, but that's why I wanted to make sure we got some ballpark there. What are we looking at cost wise when we're thinking about these processes of remediation and considering what things that we can do? I'm glad we took some time to go through a whole bunch of this. I'm sure there's more we could have talked on the subject, but we're at that hour and a half mark where I usually do my pod finish up, and I've got to move on to other things, but I really appreciate the conversation. I appreciate you coming on. Where can people learn more about your company, what you do, and give us the name of the book again, because I think that's a great tool. I'm going to share that with my clients as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for having me on. I love the
Sure.
conversation. You're asking tough questions, which is great. And I think that the point you made on value is really, it's something that you look, find the guys that know what they're talking about. Knowledge is free in today's day and age, but it takes your time and your effort. So it's not always free because you have to invest in it yourself, right? But the guys that really know what they're doing, you're usually going to have to pay a fair price to get them to do what they're doing. So I agree with that 100%.
Right.
So in terms of how to find me, moldsolutions.com. That's our website, moldsolutions.com. My company is Mold Solutions, and we're out of Tampa Bay. The book is moldebook.com. Super simple. It's a pretty quick read, a couple hours, but we'll have a bigger book that comes out that we'll actually publish, but it's a great start without a doubt. It's 3,500 homes that I've gone through in terms of the knowledge I've gleaned from where to look, what to look for, things along those lines, actionable tips. And then also on Instagram, we're very active on Instagram. You'll see my wife, my kids, they're all involved in the business with me. My kids are young, but my son's on his way to being a mold inspector. And Dr. Amara, that's my 4-year-old daughter, she talks about the impact that mold can have on your body. So it's pretty cute, but we try to keep it entertaining and educational at the same time.
Well, that's awesome. I appreciate you coming on the podcast. For the listeners, I hope you got a lot out of this. If you have any questions, put them below wherever you watch the podcast. And Brandon, I wish you the best with your business, and maybe sometime we'll get you back on the podcast and have an updated discussion on what's new and the challenges and maybe new strategies for dealing with mold in the environment.
I'd love that.
Thanks so
I'd love
much.
that. I like talking about it. Yeah, sure thing.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.